They say you should never work for a man who has a shark tank in his office, and Julian Vane was the apex predator of them all. For 3 years, I worked as his special projects director, but in reality, I was the one doing all the heavy lifting. I developed a proprietary algorithm for Aegis OS in my own time, at my own desk, using my own private servers. It was a revolutionary system that could manage the energy and security of a 100-story skyscraper with the precision of a Swiss watch. Julian saw the potential and promised me a 20% stake in the holding company once the Apex Towers project launched. I trusted him. I shared my source code, my logic gates, and my private research. I thought we were partners. I thought he was the mentor I never had. But greed has a way of turning mentors into thieves. A week before the grand opening, I found a filing on the National Patent Registry. Julian Vane had registered my algorithm under his own name. He didn't just use my work, he stole the very soul of it. When I confronted him in his penthouse office, he didn't even blink. He leaned back in his leather chair, looked at me with that patronizing smile, and told me that anything I thought during office hours belonged to him. He then handed me a termination notice and a non-compete agreement that would have prevented me from working in tech for a decade. He laughed as he told me that he had already secured a $200 million investment based on his invention. He thought he had committed the perfect crime because he had more lawyers than I had friends. He looked me in the eye and said, "In this world, darling, there are creators and there are owners. You were a great creator, but I am the owner now." He thought he had stripped me of everything, but Julian made the classic mistake of a man who doesn't understand the tools he uses. He thought a patent was a physical thing he could just lock in a safe. He didn't realize that my code wasn't just a set of instructions. It was a conversation between the hardware and a master server that only I controlled. He didn't check the licensing metadata buried in the thousands of lines of code he owned. I had embedded a compliance heartbeat into the system. Since the patent was technically under dispute and my employment was terminated, the software's legal validity expired the second I stepped out of the building. He thought he had stolen my life's work, but all he really did was install a $200 million time bomb in the most expensive building on Earth. And I was the only one who knew how to stop the clock. Walking out of Apex Towers for the last time felt like walking out of a funeral for a version of myself that was far too naive. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the cold wind whipping my hair across my face, watching the sunlight reflect off the glass skin of the building I had brought to life. I could still remember the late nights in the server room, the smell of ozone and overheated silicon, and the sheer thrill of seeing the first lights flicker to life under my command. Julian was probably up there right now, pouring a glass of 20-year-old scotch and celebrating his genius move. He saw me as a girl who was lucky to be in the room, a talented technician he could pat on the head and send away once the heavy lifting was done. He thought that because he had the title of founder on his business card, he possessed the divine right to own every spark of inspiration that came out of my mind. But Julian wasn't a creator. He was a scavenger, a man who built his empire on the backs of people he considered invisible. I went back to my small apartment, but I didn't cry. I didn't pace around in a panic. Instead, I opened my laptop and felt the familiar, soothing glow of the command line interface. Julian thought he had stolen Aegis OS, but he was looking at the body while I still held the soul. When I wrote the kernel for the system, I knew that men like Julian existed. I had seen them my entire career. Men who take credit for the architecture while barely understanding how to restart their own phones. So, I built the system with a legal integrity loop. It was a sophisticated piece of code that checked the global patent database every 6 hours. If the patent associated with the software's unique hash was flagged as contested, or if the authorized developer's heartbeat signal was severed without a signed digital release, the system would enter protective custody mode. It wasn't a crash. A crash can be fixed. This was a transition into a state of total, unyielding compliance with intellectual property law. The grand opening was scheduled for Monday morning. Every major tech influencer, real estate mogul, and potential buyer was going to be there for the smartest ribbon cutting in history. I spent the weekend monitoring the system's logs. I could see the junior developers Julian had hired to replace me trying to navigate the interface. They were changing passwords, trying to scrub my name from the metadata, and adding Julian's signature to the splash screens. It was pathetic, like watching a toddler try to rewrite a symphony. They didn't realize that every change they made was being logged as unauthorized tampering by the master server. My heart was pounding, not from fear, but from a cold, surgical excitement. I had filed the formal patent dispute on Saturday morning, and as the clock ticked toward the opening ceremony, the global database updated. The status of Julian's stolen patent shifted from granted to under review. By Monday at 8 a.m., the lobby of Apex Towers was filled with the sound of clinking champagne glasses and the low hum of cameras. Julian was on a stage in the center of the atrium, looking every bit the visionary leader he pretended to be. He was talking about the future of human dwelling and how his vision had created a sanctuary that anticipated every human need. I was watching the live stream from my kitchen table, a cold cup of coffee in my hand. I looked at the system clock on my second monitor, 8:14 a.m. The 6-hour check was about to trigger. I saw Julian reach for the giant digital touchscreen that was supposed to unlock the main doors and start the ceremonial light show. He was smiling for the photographers, his hand poised to claim his victory. He had no idea that at that exact microsecond, the legal integrity loop had finished its scan, found the patent dispute, and identified the lack of an active developer heartbeat. The smile on Julian's face didn't disappear instantly. It faded in slow, confusing stages. When he touched the screen, it didn't ripple with a beautiful light show. Instead, every single light in the 100-story building turned a flat, industrial white. Every elevator descended to the ground floor and locked its doors. The biometric sensors in every luxury suite shifted from welcome to property dispute access restricted. A giant red notification appeared on every screen in the building, from the lobby monitors to the tablets in the penthouse. Critical licensing failure. Software ownership contested. Emergency lockdown initiated by Aegis Corp. The silence that fell over the crowd was absolute. Julian tapped the screen again, harder this time, but the system didn't respond to his touch. He was no longer the owner. He was just a man standing in a glass box that had decided he was a trespasser. The silence in the atrium was so thick you could hear the air conditioning vents clicking shut. Julian's face went from a confident tan to a sickly pale gray as he realized the touchscreen wasn't just glitching, it was actively rejecting him. Behind him, the massive glass doors that led to the VIP lounge hissed and locked with a mechanical finality that sounded like a prison cell closing. The crowd of investors began to murmur, then panic. This wasn't the seamless future they had been promised. It was a trap. I watched through the building's own security cameras, which were still feeding a stream to my private server. I saw Julian's lead lawyer scramble toward him, whispering frantically into his ear. They thought they could just reboot the system. They didn't understand that Aegis OS wasn't running on their servers anymore. It was running on a logic loop that required my specific encryption key to unlock the master functions. By 10 a.m., Apex Towers was 100-story chaos. Because the elevators were locked at the ground floor for safety compliance, the billionaires who had already moved into the upper floors were effectively stranded. The mood-sensitive windows, sensing the rising stress levels of the occupants, defaulted to a deep, opaque black to reduce environmental stimuli. People were trapped in million-dollar penthouses in total darkness, with no way to call the front desk because the internal communication system was flagged as unlicensed hardware. Julian was screaming at his new IT team in the lobby, but every time they tried to bypass my kernel, the building's sirens would trigger a tamper alert, blasting a deafening 120 decibel tone through the atrium. It was beautiful. I wasn't hurting anyone. I was simply enforcing the boundaries of my own property. Julian finally did what I knew he would. He called my personal number. I let it ring for a full minute before answering. His voice was a jagged mess of rage and desperation. He didn't ask how I was. He threatened to have me arrested for domestic terrorism. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the sirens wailing in the background of his call. "Julian," I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. "Terrorism requires a crime. I'm just a citizen protecting her patented intellectual property from unauthorized commercial use. You fired the license holder, remember? By law, I have to ensure my code isn't being used illegally. I'm actually doing you a favor by stopping you from committing further copyright infringement." There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear him breathing, realized he was cornered by his own greed. He told me he'd pay the $50 million. I told him the price had just gone up to $100, plus a public admission that I was the sole inventor of the Aegis algorithm. By 4 p.m, the world's smartest building was the world's biggest high-tech joke. The story had gone full wildfire. Billionaires trapped in darkness, Apex Towers lockdown, the $5 billion error. The headlines were brutal, and they were everywhere. Live helicopter feeds from news networks showed Julian Vance in the transparent lobby, not as the king of New York real estate, but as a trapped, flailing animal. Investors were not just pulling out, they were initiating class action lawsuits. The $200 million investment he had bragged about that very morning was now a negative number, a radioactive liability. Every time Julian tried to make a public statement, the building's internal PA system, detecting his voice as unauthorized user, would automatically override his mic and announce in my smooth, calm, synthesized voice, "Aegis Core can only be accessed by the licensed developer. Please step aside for your own safety." The best part, the cold, perfect detail, was that Julian's new team of top-tier data scientists was making things even worse. They thought they could simply overwrite the license files in the root directory. They didn't understand the depth of my architecture. The Aegis system viewed their attempts as a malware attack. In response, it initiated a secured isolation protocol. I watched on my screens as the window glass in the entire building didn't just turn black. It transitioned into privacy mode, which meant it polarized to reflect light inward, blinding everyone in the atrium with a searing white light. The sirens, which had been off, started pulsing a low, vibrating tone that could shake the teeth out of your head. It wasn't a crash. It was my software protecting itself by making the physical building uninhabitable for everyone except the creator. I was sitting in my favorite cafe, sipping a perfectly made latte, when my phone rang for the 3rd time. It was a secure line from the holding company's chairman of the board. He was authorized to bypass Julian and resolve the licensing crisis immediately. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't gloat. I just gave them my terms. $100 million. $50 for the stolen patent, $50 for the emotional distress and unlawful termination. Plus, a formal, irrevocable acknowledgement of my sole authorship of the Aegis code, published on every platform they owned. They tried to bargain, offering me a senior consultancy position. I almost laughed. "I don't think you understand, gentlemen," I said, watching the live feed of Julian's face covered in sweat. "You don't need a consultant, you need an owner. And right now, the only owner of this $5 billion asset is me. The offer expires in 10 minutes. The transfer of the first $50 million cleared in exactly 9 minutes and 50 seconds. I received a separate notification of the chairman's digital signature on the patent release form. I sent them one final message: wait. I didn't even have to use my laptop. I pulled up my smartphone, opened a terminal app I had built just for this, and initiated a restoration heartbeat to the Aegis core. With a single light tap on my screen, the white light in the building faded. The sirens died, the elevators returned to normal operation, and the penthouse windows cleared to show the stunning view of the city. Everything went back to being a luxury sanctuary. I stood up, walked out of the cafe, and felt the warm city air on my face. Julian Vance had his building back, but the world knew he was just a landlord who had been humbled by a woman with a smartphone. I hadn't just taken his money, I had taken his pride, his reputation, and his belief that his title made him the owner of other people's minds. I was the master now. The following weeks were a masterclass in corporate self-destruction. Julian Vance didn't just lose his reputation, he lost his soul. The Apex Tower's grand opening, which was meant to be the crowning achievement of his life, became the most expensive public failure in real estate history. Even though the lights were back on and the elevators were moving, the damage was done. The billionaires who had planned to call the building home realized that their luxury lifestyle was entirely dependent on a system Julian couldn't control. The contracts were canceled, the lawsuits piled up like snow in winter, and by the end of the month, Julian was forced to step down as CEO of his own empire. He had the building, but it was an empty shell, a $5 billion monument to his own arrogance. I didn't stay to watch the debris fall. I used my $100 million settlement to build something Julian could never understand, a private, decentralized research lab where the creators are the only owners. I bought a villa overlooking the Mediterranean, far away from the glass towers and the sharks in suits. Sometimes, late at night, I log into the public traffic cameras near Apex Towers. I see the building standing there, glowing in the New York skyline, and I smile. Julian tried to treat me like a component, a replaceable part in his machine. He forgot that without the architect, a skyscraper is just a very expensive pile of rocks. He thought he could steal my patent and erase my name, but in the end, my name was the only thing that could make his world work again. If you're listening to this, remember, your mind is the only thing they can't truly take from you unless you let them. They can steal your code, they can copy your designs, and they can sign their names on your work. No, they will never understand the why behind the how. They are just landlords in a world built by geniuses. If you enjoyed this story of high-stakes revenge and intellectual justice, make sure to subscribe to Unsaid Stories. Hit the like button to stand with the creators against the thieves, and tell me in the comments, if you had the power to lock down your workplace with a single click, would you do it? My name is Elias, and this was the day the smartest building in the world learned who its real master was. I'll see you in the next one. The aftermath was even colder than the lockdown itself. Julian Vance tried one last desperate move. He hired a team of high-priced fixers to paint me as a cyber terrorist in the media. But you can't spin the truth when the truth is written in immutable code. My lawyers, now funded by the initial $50 million wire transfer, fired back with a countersuit that made Julian's head spin. We didn't just sue for the patent. We sued for character assassination, breach of contract, and gender-based discrimination in the workplace. We had every internal email, every recorded meeting where Julian called me the girl in the basement, and every log showing him trying to scrub my name from history. The legal shredder I put him through was so thorough that by the second week, his own board of directors voted to strip him of his remaining shares just to save what was left of the company's reputation. I watched from my new home as the Apex Towers project was officially rebranded. They had to pay me a separate, recurring licensing fee just to keep the building's elevators moving. Julian Vance, the man who once thought he owned the sky, was now legally barred from entering the very building he spent 5 years bragging about. His assets were frozen. His shark tank was sold at an auction to pay for his mounting legal fees. And the last I heard, he was living in a rented apartment in Jersey, still trying to find a lawyer who would take his calls. He learned the hardest lesson of all. When you steal a masterpiece, you don't become the artist. You just become a thief holding a canvas you don't know how to explain. Now, I look at the tech industry from the outside, and I see so many owners trying to find the next creator to exploit. They think that a contract is a leash and that a paycheck is a purchase order for a person's soul. But the world is changing. The age of the arrogant CEO who builds empires on stolen brilliance is coming to an end. We are the ones with the keys. We are the ones who understand the logic behind the chaos. And as Julian Vance found out, you can have all the billions in the world, but if the code doesn't recognize your face, you're just a stranger standing in the rain. Thank you for staying until the end of this journey. If you've ever been underestimated, underpaid, or had your work claimed by someone who didn't put in the hours, this story was for you. Subscribe to Unsaid Stories for more tales where the genius finally wins. Don't forget to hit the like button and check out our other videos about high-stakes corporate revenge. In a world of scavengers, be the architect. My name is Costa, and I'll see you in the next story.